I was born in a city that smelled of bitumen and wet reeds, in a time when kings still believed their names would hold against the wind. They told me I was a prince of Ur, though I never understood what that meant beyond the weight of other people's expectations and the careful way servants avoided my eyes. They taught me the hymns to Nana, the moon god, whose temple rose in terraces above the dust. I learned the rituals, the measured offerings, the precise words that were supposed to bind heaven to earth. I remember thinking even then that the gods required too much choreography. If they were truly powerful, why insist on such careful staging? I died the first time at 19. There was a fever. There was a long night filled with the smell of copper and sweat. Then there was a silence, so complete it seemed like a presence. I remember stepping into it, relieved, as if I had finally been excused from something. Then I awoke again. The room had changed, the city had changed, the language had shifted just enough to feel like a dream of itself. They told me I had been found outside the walls, confused, naked, with no memory of how I had come there. I did not tell them I remembered everything. I did not tell them I had died. That was the beginning of my education. I sought out the priests again, or their successors, who had inherited the same gestures without the same conviction. They spoke of cycles, of descent and return, of the underworld as a place of shadow and forgetting. I listened carefully. I waited for one of them to say, "Yes, you can come back. Yes, you can walk out of death as if it were a room you had grown tired of." No one said this. So I left. I changed my name. Names, I found, are like garments. They signal belonging. They give others permission to accept you. I wore many. In Egypt, I studied with men who believed the soul could be preserved if the body were properly prepared. They dried the flesh, removed the organs, wrapped the bones in linen, and spoke with great confidence about eternity. I watched them seal a man into a stone chamber with all the objects he might need in the next life. I waited outside for 3 days. Nothing happened. I realized then that they had mistaken preservation for continuation. They were curators of the dead, not guides for the living. So I moved on. In the forests of northern India, I sat with men who had renounced everything. They spoke of illusion, of the self as a construct, of desire as the root of suffering. One of them, a quiet man with a gaze that seemed to pass through me, said, "What you think you are is not what you are." I considered this for a long time. I fasted, I meditated, I stripped away piece by piece the habits that had defined me. I watched my thoughts rise and fall like insects on water. I came to see how unstable the mind is, how quickly it invents and discards identities. But I did not disappear. No matter how much I let go, something remained, something that continued stubbornly across time. They called it Atman. They called it Brahman. They said it was universal, not personal. This did not satisfy me. I did not want to dissolve. I wanted to understand why I persisted. So I left. In the hills of Judea, I listened to men argue about law and covenant. They spoke of a single God who demanded obedience and in return offered a form of justice that extended beyond death. I was drawn to the certainty of it, the clarity. Then I met a man who spoke differently. He spoke of love as if it were a force rather than a sentiment. He spoke of the kingdom of heaven as something already present, if only one could see it. I followed him for a time. I watched the way people leaned toward him, as if he were a fire in a cold place. After he died, I waited. I thought perhaps he would return, not as a symbol, but as a fact. When nothing happened, I understood that his followers would build something from his absence. They would turn his life into a structure, something that could be inhabited. But I did not want a structure, so I left. In Alexandria, I studied with philosophers who believed the universe could be understood through reason. They mapped the heavens. They argued about substance and form. They believed, with a kind of quiet arrogance, that the mind could grasp the underlying order of things. I admired their discipline, but their systems always ended at the same place. They could describe the world. They could categorize it. They could even predict certain aspects of it. But they could not explain why I did not end. So I left. In the deserts, I lived with men who spoke to God through silence. They believed withdrawal would reveal truth. I admired their austerity, their refusal to be distracted. But their silence was filled with the same questions I carried. They called it a mystery and accepted it. I could not accept it and left. Centuries passed. I learned to move quickly now, to shed identities before they grew heavy. I became a monk in one century, a scholar in another, a merchant, a soldier, a teacher. Each role offered a new language for the same question. In China, I followed men who spoke of balance, of the way things flow into one another. They taught me to observe rather than impose, to see the pattern rather than force it. This was the closest I came to peace, but even there, the question remained like a stone in the shoe. Balance did not explain persistence. Harmony did not account for anomaly. I was still here. I recently turned to science. I thought, finally, here is a discipline that demands evidence. Here is a method that tests its own assumptions. I studied biology, physics, and chemistry. I learned about cells, about decay, about entropy. I watched as they described the mechanisms of life with increasing precision. They could tell me how a body fails. They could not tell me why mine did not. I submitted to tests. I allowed them to measure me, to scan me, to take samples of my blood. They found nothing unusual. I was, in every measurable way, ordinary, except for the one thing that mattered. Time passed through me without effect. They began to look at me differently then. They saw me as a problem, a curiosity, something to be explained or failing that, contained. And so, I continue. I change my name, I adjust my manner. I adopt the language of whatever age I find myself in. I listen to the teachers. I study their systems. I commit for a time to their explanations. Each one offers a piece. None offers the whole. I have come to understand that what I am looking for may not exist. Or worse, It exists in a form that cannot be articulated. Something that resists language, that dissolves when you try to hold it still. There are moments, brief and unsettling, when I consider the possibility that there is no reason, that my condition is not a message, not a test, not a gift or a curse, but simply an occurrence, an error perhaps, a line of code that failed to execute properly. In those moments, I feel a kind of vertigo, because if there is no reason, then there is no answer waiting at the end of this, no final teacher, no last revelation, just continuation. And I find myself once again in a new place, under a different sky, listening to another man explain how the world works, hoping, against all accumulated evidence, that this time he will say something that stops me, something that ends it, or at least explains why it does not end.